Sometimes, the truth hides in places you never think to look. And when it finally reveals itself, it doesn't ask for permission, it demands to be heard. The boy stood there in the middle of the courtroom, his small trembling frame almost swallowed by the oversized blazer he'd been given to look presentable. His dark brown eyes, wide with raw emotion, locked onto the judge. The words came out shaky at first, but as if driven by something greater, his voice grew louder, steadier. "You're my mom." The room fell deathly silent. A gasp rippled through the courtroom gallery. Lawyers froze mid-note. The stenographer stopped typing. Even the air seemed to thicken, weighing down on everyone in the room. The judge, a woman in her early 50s with sharp features softened only by her kind gray eyes, blinked rapidly as though trying to process the words that had just shattered the carefully orchestrated atmosphere of professionalism. Her gavel, which moments before had been an emblem of authority, now sat useless in her hand. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Judge Eleanor Gray finally managed to ask, her voice betraying the calm demeanor she was so well known for. The boy stepped closer, his small dark hands gripping the edge of the podium in front of him like it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. "You're my mom," he repeated, his voice breaking now, the vulnerability in it cutting deeper than any legal argument ever could. "I know you are." And just like that, the courtroom transformed from a place of law and order into something more human, more fragile, a stage where secrets long buried were being unearthed in front of an audience who had no idea what to do with them. But how did it come to this? How did a young black boy and a respected white judge end up in the same room, locked in a moment so profound that it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath? To understand, we have to go back. Back to the beginning. 12-year-old Elijah Campbell had grown up knowing one thing for sure: the world wasn't kind to boys like him. Boys with skin the color of rich mahogany, who walked to school clutching their books tight, trying to avoid the gaze of police cars that always seemed to slow down when they passed by. Elijah lived with his grandmother, a sharp-tongued but warm-hearted woman named Bernice. She'd raised him from the time he was a baby, after his mother, her only child, died from what Bernice cryptically referred to as a bad crowd and worse choices. Elijah never pushed for details. He'd learned that when Bernice didn't want to talk about something, it was better to let it be. But Elijah had always felt the weight of not knowing where he came from. He would sit on the steps of their crumbling house in the south side of Chicago, staring at the kids playing in the street and wondering if somewhere out there, he had family who didn't even know he existed. One day, while cleaning out an old chest in the attic, Elijah stumbled upon a faded photograph tucked inside a worn Bible. The photo was of a young woman who looked just like him, same almond-shaped eyes, same high cheekbones. On the back, written in neat cursive, were the words, "Eleanor, 1989. "Grandma, who's this?" Elijah had asked, holding up the photo like it was some kind of treasure map. Bernice's face darkened, her hand stilling on the dish she was scrubbing. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Finally, she sighed and wiped her hands on her apron. "That's nobody you need to worry about, child," she said, her voice firm but her eyes betraying a flicker of something Elijah couldn't quite place. Fear? Regret? But Elijah was persistent. Over the next few weeks, he began piecing together snippets of overheard conversations, old documents, and the few details his grandmother let slip when she thought he wasn't paying attention. What he discovered didn't make sense at first. A judge? His mom? How could someone like that be connected to him? The more he dug, the more determined he became. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful or complicated it might be. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Judge Eleanor Gray was living a life that, from the outside, seemed flawless. She presided over some of the most high-profile cases in the state, earning a reputation for being both fair and unyielding. She lived alone in a sprawling suburban house, her days meticulously planned and her nights often spent reviewing case files or attending charity galas. But Eleanor had her own ghosts. She kept them locked away in a corner of her mind she rarely visited, buried under years of professional achievements and societal expectations. She told herself that the past was the past, and no good could come from unearthing it. Until the day Elijah walked into her courtroom. It had started as a routine custody case, a child caught in the middle of a bitter dispute between a foster system that had failed him and a grandmother too old and too tired to keep fighting. Eleanor had seen hundreds of cases like it. She had no reason to think this one would be any different. But then Elijah had spoken. He had looked her straight in the eye, and something about the way he said her name, her first name, sent a chill down her spine. And now, as the weight of his words hung heavy in the air, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Panic. Elijah, she said slowly, her voice carefully measured, I need you to explain what you mean. But before the boy could respond, a voice from the back of the courtroom interrupted. He's lying. He doesn't know what he's talking about. All heads turned to see Bernice Campbell standing, her face a storm of anger and desperation. She clutched her purse to her chest like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. Your Honor, I need to speak with you privately, Bernice said, her voice trembling. Eleanor's eyes darted between the boy and the woman. She knew she should call a recess, regain control of the situation. But something in Elijah's expression so vulnerable, so certain kept her frozen in place. Elijah, Eleanor said again, her voice softening despite herself, tell me why you think I'm your mother. The boy opened his mouth to answer, but before he could get a single word out, Bernice collapsed. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Paramedics were called, the gallery was cleared, and Elijah was ushered into a back room with a social worker who looked as flustered as everyone else. As Eleanor sat at her bench, staring at the empty space where Bernice had just been, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. She didn't know the boy. She couldn't possibly be his mother. Could she? The ambulance siren wailed as it sped away from the courthouse. Bernice's collapse had stunned everyone, but no one more than Elijah. He had never seen his grandmother like that, so fragile, so mortal. The woman who raised him, who seemed as unshakable as the earth itself, now lay in a hospital bed, her fate uncertain. Elijah sat in the cold waiting room of Mercy General Hospital, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The social worker, a young woman named Amanda, sat beside him, her presence offering little comfort. She kept glancing at her phone, her nervous energy palpable. Elijah, honey, do you want a snack or something to drink? Amanda asked, breaking the heavy silence. He shook his head without looking at her. His mind was spinning. What if Grandma doesn't wake up? What if? He forced himself to stop thinking. He couldn't afford to spiral right now. Meanwhile, Judge Eleanor Gray sat in her office, staring at the photograph Elijah's lawyer had placed on her desk before the commotion. The picture showed a young version of herself, barely out of high school, holding a baby in her arms. She traced her finger over the image, her mind racing. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. Eleanor's mind drifted back to a time she had worked so hard to forget. She was only 16 when her life had taken a turn she hadn't seen coming. A baby. Born into a situation that her strict, church-going parents had deemed shameful. There had been hushed conversations, hurried decisions, and finally, a baby handed to another family under the guise of doing what was best for everyone. She had been told never to speak of it again, and Eleanor had obeyed. For years, she had buried that chapter of her life so deeply that sometimes it felt like it belonged to someone else. But now, sitting here with this photo in her hand, the memories came rushing back with a force that nearly knocked the air out of her lungs. The knock on her office door startled her. Her clerk, Rachel, poked her head in, looking concerned. Judge Gray, I thought you'd want to know. Elijah's grandmother was taken to Mercy General. It doesn't look good. Eleanor nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Thank you, Rachel. Please clear my afternoon docket. You're going to see them? Eleanor hesitated before answering. I just need to understand what's going on. Back at the hospital, Elijah was finally allowed to see Bernice. She was pale and hooked up to a dozen machines that beeped and blinked in a disconcerting rhythm. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard Elijah's voice. Grandma, he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Baby, Bernice's voice was weak, her words slurred. I told you to leave it alone. Elijah leaned in closer. Grandma, what are you talking about? Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you tell her? Bernice closed her eyes, as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. I was protecting you, and her. She wasn't ready, Elijah. She was just a girl. She didn't have a choice. But she's my mom, isn't she? Elijah's voice cracked as he finally said the words out loud. She's my mom, and you've known this whole time. Bernice didn't answer, but the look in her eyes was all the confirmation Elijah needed. Eleanor arrived at the hospital just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She hesitated at the entrance, unsure of what she was even doing there. She wasn't obligated to get involved. This wasn't her problem. And yet, something inside her, something she couldn't quite name, kept pulling her forward. After some convincing, the nurse led her to Bernice's room. When Eleanor stepped inside, she was met with Elijah's startled gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "What are you doing here?" Elijah finally asked, his voice filled with suspicion. Eleanor hesitated. "I came to see your grandmother." Elijah crossed his arms, clearly not buying her explanation. "You mean you came to see if it's true?" The accusation stung more than Eleanor wanted to admit. "Elijah, Don't," he snapped, his voice louder now. "Don't act like you care. You don't know anything about me or my grandma. You don't even remember me." "Elijah." Bernice's weak voice interrupted the tense exchange. "Stop it. Let her speak." Eleanor stepped closer to the bed, her heart pounding. She looked down at Bernice, who seemed to be fighting just to keep her eyes open. "You've known this whole time, haven't you?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Bernice gave a weak nod. "I didn't want to bring you into it. You had your life. He had his. It wasn't my place." Eleanor clenched her fists, anger bubbling to the surface. "Not your place. He's She stopped herself, the words catching in her throat. "He's my son. I had a right to know." "You gave up that right," Bernice shot back, her voice gaining a sudden strength. "You gave it up when you handed him over and walked away." The words hit Eleanor like a slap to the face. She opened her mouth to argue, to defend herself, but nothing came out. Elijah watched the exchange, his emotions a storm brewing just beneath the surface. "So what now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What are you gonna do now, Judge Gray?" Eleanor didn't have an answer. She felt the weight of the question pressing down on her, suffocating her. But before she could respond, Bernice's monitors began to beep erratically. "Grandma!" Elijah cried, rushing to her side. The room erupted into chaos as nurses and doctors flooded in, pushing Eleanor and Elijah out into the hallway. Eleanor stood there, staring at the closed door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come here for answers, but all she'd found were more questions. And now, as the faint sound of Elijah's sobs reached her ears, one question loomed larger than all the rest. What kind of mother could she be now? Elijah sat slumped in the hard plastic chair of the hospital waiting room, his head buried in his hands. His chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a band around it and kept tightening. The beeping machines, the frantic nurses, none of it felt real. He glanced at the closed doors to his grandmother's room. Somewhere behind them, doctors were fighting to keep the only real family he'd ever known alive. He hated that he couldn't do anything to help her. He hated how powerless he felt. Across the room, Judge Eleanor Gray sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked out of place in the worn, sterile waiting room, her crisp suit and polished demeanor at odds with the chaos around her. She hadn't said a word since they were forced out of Bernice's room. Elijah finally broke the silence. "Why are you still here?" His voice was sharp, laced with a bitterness far beyond his 12 years. Eleanor didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her expression calm but unreadable. "Because I think you deserve answers." Elijah snorted, shaking his head. "Answers? You think you can just show up after 12 years and fix everything with answers? That's not how this works." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "I'm not here to fix anything, Elijah. I can't change the past. But if there's even the smallest chance that she stopped herself, the word too heavy to say out loud just yet. "If there's a chance, don't you think we should figure that out?" Elijah glared at her. "Figure it out? Like I'm some math problem? You don't get it. You don't know what it's like to grow up wondering why your mom didn't want you. Why you weren't good enough." The words cut Eleanor deeply, but she forced herself to stay composed. "You're wrong about that," she said softly. Elijah frowned, his anger faltering for a moment. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before Eleanor could answer, the doors to Bernice's room swung open, and a doctor stepped out. Elijah was on his feet in an instant, his heart hammering in his chest. "How is she?" he asked, his voice trembling. The doctor sighed, pulling off his mask. "She's stable for now, but it was a close call. We're monitoring her closely, but she needs rest. You can see her for a few minutes, but only one at a time." Elijah nodded quickly, relief flooding through him. He started toward the room but stopped when he noticed Eleanor still sitting there, watching him. He hesitated, then turned to the doctor. "Can she come too?" The question surprised Eleanor. She hadn't expected that kind of gesture from him, not after everything. The doctor glanced between them before nodding. All right, but only for a few minutes. Inside the room, Bernice looked fragile, her usual sharpness dulled by exhaustion. Her eyes opened slowly when Elijah and Eleanor walked in. She looked at Eleanor with a mixture of wariness and resignation. Came to see how bad it was, huh? Bernice said, her voice hoarse but tinged with her usual sass. Eleanor ignored the jab. I wanted to make sure you were all right. Bernice chuckled weakly. You don't fool me, Eleanor. You're here because you think you can make up for lost time. Well, let me tell you something, you can't. Grandma, stop, Elijah said, stepping closer to her bed. She's trying. Isn't that what you always tell me? To give people a chance. Bernice looked at him, her expression softening. I was trying to protect you, Elijah, she said quietly. I didn't want you to get hurt. But I am hurt, Elijah shot back. I've been hurt my whole life because no one told me the truth. The room fell silent. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably, feeling like an intruder in a moment that wasn't entirely hers to share. Finally, Bernice let out a heavy sigh. You want the truth, boy? Fine. She's your mother. Eleanor froze. Even though she had suspected it, hearing the words spoken out loud felt like a punch to the gut. She was just a kid when she had you, Bernice continued, her eyes fixed on Elijah. Her parents shipped her off to some fancy home for girls like her, made her give you up. And when they sent her back, they acted like it never happened. She had no say in it. Elijah turned to Eleanor, his expression unreadable. Is that true? Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Yes, she said finally. It's true. Elijah stared at her for a long moment, his face a mix of anger, confusion, and something Eleanor couldn't quite identify. Why didn't you come back for me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know how. I was young and scared and selfish. I thought I was doing the right thing by staying away. But I was wrong. Bernice sighed, closing her eyes. You were both wrong, she murmured. But it's too late for regrets now. You two need to figure this out, for his sake. Eleanor looked at Bernice, then back at Elijah. I want to try, Elijah. If you'll let me, I want to be in your life. Elijah didn't respond right away. He looked down at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said finally. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I understand. But I hope one day you can. Before either of them could say more, the monitors in the room started beeping again. Eleanor and Elijah both turned to see Bernice's face slacken, her eyes fluttering closed. Grandma! Elijah yelled, rushing to her side. Doctors and nurses flooded into the room, pushing Eleanor and Elijah out into the hallway once more. This time, Elijah didn't look at Eleanor. He just stood there, staring at the door, as if willing it to open and bring his grandmother back to him. Eleanor stood a few feet away, her heart breaking for him, for herself, for the years they had both lost. And as they waited in the cold, empty hallway, one thought consumed her. If Bernice didn't make it, how could she ever make things right with the boy she had abandoned? Elijah sat on the floor of the hospital hallway, his back pressed against the wall, knees pulled to his chest. He felt like he was floating outside of his body, watching everything unfold from a distance. The sound of the monitors beeping, the sight of doctors rushing in and out of Bernice's room, it all seemed like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. Across the hall, Judge Eleanor Gray stood stiffly, her arms crossed as though she were trying to hold herself together. Her carefully curated mask of composure had begun to crack, and it was clear she didn't know what to do with herself. She kept glancing at Elijah, wanting to say something, but every time she opened her mouth, the words stuck in her throat. Finally, the door to Bernice's room opened, and a doctor stepped out. His expression was grim but measured, the kind of face doctors wore when they had to deliver news that could break someone. She's stable for now, he said, his voice calm but cautious. But her heart is weak. The next 24 hours are critical. Elijah felt a mix of relief and fear wash over him. Stable, but critical. It wasn't much, but it was something. Can I see her? He asked, his voice barely audible. The doctor nodded. Only for a little while. She needs rest. Elijah didn't hesitate. He stood up and walked toward the room, but stopped in the doorway. He turned back to Eleanor, his expression conflicted. You can come too, he said quietly. Eleanor's eyebrows lifted in surprise. She hadn't expected him to offer, not after everything. But she nodded and followed him inside. Bernice looked even frilier now, her face pale and her breathing labored. But when she saw Elijah, a small tired smile tugged at her lips. "Hey there, baby," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah sat in the chair next to her bed, taking her hand gently in his. "Hey, Grandma. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," she joked weakly. Her eyes shifted to Eleanor, who stood awkwardly by the foot of the bed. "And look who's still here. Didn't think you had it in you, Eleanor." Eleanor forced a small smile, unsure how to respond. "I'm just glad you're all right," she said. Bernice scoffed softly. "Don't sugarcoat it. You're here because you're trying to figure out how to fix this mess." Elijah frowned. "Grandma, stop." "No, he needs to hear this," Bernice said, her voice growing steadier. She looked at Eleanor, her gaze piercing despite her weakened state. "You can't just waltz back in and expect everything to fall into place. This boy's been through too much for that. If you're serious about being in his life, you're gonna have to earn it." "I know," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "I'm not expecting him to forgive me overnight. But I want to try. I have to try." Elijah looked between the two women, his emotions a tangled knot in his chest. Part of him wanted to believe Eleanor, to give her a chance. But the other part of him, the part that had spent years wondering why he wasn't good enough, wasn't ready to let her in. "Why now?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharp. "Why do you care now? Is it because you saw me in your courtroom and felt guilty? Or because it's embarrassing to have people know you abandoned your kid?" Eleanor flinched at his words, but she didn't look away. "You have every right to be angry," she said. "And you're right, I do feel guilty. I've felt guilty every day since I gave you up. But I was scared, Elijah. I was a scared 16-year-old girl who didn't know how to fight for you. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Elijah didn't respond. He turned back to Bernice, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "I don't know what to do, Grandma," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can trust her." Bernice's eyes softened as she looked at him. "Trust takes time, baby. You don't have to decide everything right now. Just give it time." Elijah nodded, though he didn't feel any less conflicted. Later that night, Eleanor found herself sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She stared at the table, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and regrets. She thought about the baby she had held in her arms all those years ago, the tiny boy who had looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. She thought about the promises she had made to herself, promises to one day come back for him, to make things right. But life had a way of getting in the way. College, law school, her career. She had always told herself she would look for him once she was ready. But ready had never come. And now, here they were, thrown together by fate in the most unexpected way. As Eleanor sat there, lost in thought, she didn't notice Elijah approaching until he was standing right in front of her. "Can I sit?" he asked, his tone cautious. Eleanor nodded, motioning to the chair across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Elijah broke the silence. "I don't get it," he said, his voice quiet. "If you felt so guilty, why didn't you ever try to find me?" Eleanor sighed, her hands wrapping around her coffee cup. "I told myself I would someday. But every time I thought about it, I got scared. Scared that you'd hate me, or that you wouldn't want anything to do with me. So I kept putting it off. And then, after so many years, I didn't know how to start." Elijah looked down at the table, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. "I don't know if I believe you," he admitted. "I don't blame you," Eleanor said. "But I'm here now. And I'll keep showing up, as long as you'll let me." Elijah didn't respond right away. He wanted to believe her, but trust didn't come easy to him. It never had. Before he could say anything else, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from the hospital. "Come to room 214. Immediate family only." His stomach dropped. Without a word, he stood up and started running toward Bernice's room, Eleanor close on his heels. When they arrived, a nurse met them at the door. "She's awake," the nurse said, her expression kind but serious. "But you need to prepare yourselves. She doesn't have much time." Elijah felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He pushed past the nurse and entered the room, his heart pounding. Bernice looked up at him, her face pale but peaceful. "Come here, baby," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah rushed to her side, tears streaming down his face. Eleanor stayed by the door, her hand pressed against her chest as she struggled to hold herself together. Bernice smiled weakly, her eyes full of love. "I'm proud of you, Elijah," she said. "And I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Elijah choked out. "Promise me, you'll let her try," Bernice said, glancing toward Eleanor. "Promise me you won't shut her out. She's not perfect, but neither am I. And you deserve a chance to know her." Elijah nodded, his tears falling onto her frail hand. "I promise, Grandma." Bernice closed her eyes, her breathing slowing. And then, as Elijah held her hand and Eleanor watched from the doorway, Bernice took her final breath. The room was eerily silent after Bernice's final breath. The hum of the machines and the faint shuffle of nurses in the hallway outside only made the quiet feel heavier. Elijah sat frozen, his hand still clutching Bernice's lifeless one, as though holding on could somehow bring her back. His chest heaved with quiet sobs. The weight of her absence settled in, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely untethered. The one person who had been his rock, his guide, his everything, was gone. Eleanor remained by the door, her hand gripping the frame as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She had never been good with grief, not her own and certainly not someone else's. Her heart ached as she watched Elijah, a boy who had already endured more than most adults, crumble under the weight of this new loss. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice barely audible. "She's gone." Eleanor stepped forward hesitantly, unsure if her presence would be welcome. "Elijah," she started, but her words faltered. What could she possibly say to make this better? Nothing. Elijah shook his head, his grief turning into anger. Why did this have to happen now? Why now, when everything's already so messed up? He turned to Eleanor, his eyes blazing with emotion. Why couldn't she stay? Why couldn't you come sooner? Eleanor flinched but didn't back away. She knew his anger wasn't really about her, it was about everything. Still, his words hit her harder than she expected. "I wish I had," she said softly. "I wish I had been there for both of you sooner. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Elijah stared at her, his face a mixture of pain, anger, and uncertainty. "It's too late. She's the only family I had. You don't get to just swoop in and act like you can replace her." "I'm not trying to replace her," Eleanor said quickly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "No one could ever replace her. She was an incredible woman. But I want to be here for you, Elijah, however you'll let me. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway." Elijah looked away, his jaw clenched. "I don't know if I can do this." "You don't have to decide anything right now," Eleanor said gently. "Just take your time. I'll be here when you're ready." The days following Bernice's passing were a blur for Elijah. Between funeral arrangements, well-meaning neighbors bringing over casseroles he didn't touch, and the endless stream of people offering condolences, he felt like he was moving through a fog. Eleanor stayed close but kept her distance, careful not to push him. She helped where she could handling paperwork, coordinating with the funeral home, but she never overstepped. She could tell Elijah was still figuring out how to feel about her, and she didn't want to make things worse. The funeral was small but heartfelt. It was held at the same church Bernice had attended every Sunday without fail, her Bible often in hand and her voice the loudest during hymns. The pastor spoke about her strength, her faith, and her unwavering love for Elijah. Elijah sat in the front pew, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He barely heard the words being spoken. His mind was elsewhere, flashing through memories of Bernice teaching him to tie his shoes, showing him how to make sweet potato pie, scolding him for staying out too late. When the service ended, Elijah stayed behind as the crowd filtered out. He sat alone in the quiet sanctuary, staring at the casket as though he could will it to open and bring her back. Eleanor hesitated at the back of the church, watching him. She wanted to go to him, to comfort him, but she wasn't sure if he would accept it. Finally, she made her way down the aisle and sat beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them. "She would have been proud of you today," Eleanor said softly. Elijah didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "She was all I had." "I know," Eleanor said, her heart breaking for him. "I can't imagine how hard this is for you. But you're not alone, Elijah. You still have people who care about you." He turned to her, his eyes filled with tears. "Why do you care? You didn't before." Eleanor took a deep breath. You're right. I wasn't there when I should have been, and that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I care now because you're my son. And because you deserve to have someone in your corner. Elijah shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. You don't even know me. Then let me get to know you, Eleanor said, her voice firm but kind. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Elijah. I'm just asking you to let me try. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to settle into a new normal. Elijah moved into a temporary foster home while the court decided what would happen next. Eleanor had offered to take him in, but he hadn't given her an answer yet. He spent most of his time keeping to himself, lost in his thoughts. But every few days, Eleanor would show up. Sometimes she'd bring dinner or a book she thought he might like. Other times, she just sat with him in silence, giving him space while letting him know she was there. One evening, Elijah finally broke the silence. You don't have to keep coming, you know. I'm not your responsibility. Eleanor looked at him, her expression serious. You're not a responsibility, Elijah. You're my son. He didn't respond, but for the first time, he didn't push her away. Things seemed to be settling into an uneasy rhythm when the letter arrived. It was delivered to the foster home, addressed to Elijah in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. He opened it cautiously, his heart racing as he read the first line. Dear Elijah, I think it's time you knew the whole truth about your mother. Elijah stared at the letter, his mind reeling. What truth? What didn't he already know? He looked up at Eleanor, who had come over for dinner that night. Did you write this? He asked, holding up the letter. Eleanor frowned. No. What is it? Elijah handed it to her, his hands trembling. As she read the words, her expression darkened. I didn't write this, she said, her voice tense. But whoever did knows something. And I think we need to find out what. The letter ended with an address and a single sentence. Come alone if you want answers. Elijah and Eleanor exchanged a look, both of them feeling the weight of the mystery hanging between them. Are you going? Eleanor asked. Elijah nodded slowly. Yeah, I have to. Neither of them could have known just how much the answers waiting at that address would change everything. The address on the letter led to an old house on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been forgotten by time-faded paint, sagging porch steps, and weeds creeping up through the cracks in the driveway. The evening sun cast long shadows across the yard, giving the whole scene an eerie, almost surreal feeling. Elijah hesitated at the gate, the letter crumpled in his hand. His heart pounded as he stared at the house, a million questions swirling in his mind. Who had sent the letter? What did they know? And why had they waited until now to say anything? Eleanor parked her car a little farther down the road, not wanting to draw attention. She had insisted on coming, despite the letter's instruction to come alone. You don't have to do this, Eleanor said gently, stepping up beside him. I do, Elijah replied, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. Eleanor nodded, her eyes scanning the house. All right. But if something doesn't feel right, we leave. Promise me that. Elijah nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he could keep that promise. They made their way up the cracked walkway, the sound of their footsteps loud in the stillness. When they reached the door, Elijah hesitated before raising his hand to knock. Before he could, the door creaked open. An older black man stood in the doorway, his face weathered and lined with years of hard living. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert, studying Elijah and Eleanor with an intensity that made them both uneasy. You must be Elijah, the man said, his voice deep and gravelly. Elijah nodded. Who are you? The man stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. Name's Raymond. I'm the one who sent the letter. Come in, I've got something you need to see. Eleanor's instincts screamed at her to keep Elijah outside, to demand more answers before stepping into the unknown. But Elijah moved forward, driven by curiosity and a need for closure, and she had no choice but to follow. The inside of the house was just as worn as the outside, with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of dust and old wood. Raymond led them to a small sitting room where a stack of boxes sat on the coffee table. What's all this? Elijah asked, eyeing the boxes warily. Your history, Raymond replied, sitting down in an armchair and motioning for them to take a seat. Stuff that was buried, literally and figuratively. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean, buried? Raymond leaned back, his gaze shifting to Elijah. I knew your grandmother, kid. Bernice. We grew up together back in the day. She wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Elijah's eyes narrowed. What kind of secrets? Raymond reached into one of the boxes and pulled out an old photograph. He handed it to Elijah, who stared at it in confusion. The picture showed a group of young people standing in front of a small church. Among them was a teenage girl who looked strikingly like Eleanor, standing next to a boy with the same deep brown eyes as Elijah. "That's your mom," Raymond said, pointing to the girl. "And that's your father." Elijah's breath caught. "My father." Raymond nodded. His name was Marcus. He was a good kid. Smart, kind. But he made some bad choices, got caught up in some bad stuff. By the time your mom found out she was pregnant, Marcus was already on the run. And then he disappeared. Eleanor's face paled. Disappeared how? Raymond sighed, his expression darkening. There were rumors. Some said he left town to avoid trouble. Others said he didn't make it out alive. But no one ever found out for sure. Elijah stared at the photo, his mind racing. He had spent his entire life wondering about his father, and now he was being told he might never get the answers he wanted. "Why are you telling me this now?" Elijah asked, his voice sharp. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Raymond looked at him, his expression heavy with regret. "Because Bernice didn't want you to know. She thought it would just make things harder for you. But after she passed, I figured, you deserve to know where you came from." Elijah set the photo down, his hands trembling. "So what am I supposed to do with this?" Raymond leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Elijah's. "That's up to you, kid. But if you really want to know the truth, there's more." He reached into another box and pulled out a faded journal. This was Marcus's. Bernice kept it after he disappeared. "She didn't think you were ready for it, but I think you are now." Elijah hesitated before taking the journal. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. As he flipped through it, he saw entries written in messy handwriting, some pages smudged with what looked like water stains. One entry caught his eye. It was dated 2 weeks before he was born. "If anything happens to me, I need someone to tell my son the truth. He deserves to know who he is and where he comes from. He deserves better than I had." Elijah's hands shook as he read the words. For the first time, he felt a connection to a man he had never met, a man who had clearly cared about him even if he hadn't been there. Eleanor reached out, her hand hovering over his shoulder. "Elijah, are you okay?" He nodded slowly, though his mind was a storm of emotions. "I don't know what to feel," he admitted. Raymond cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into the box and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "This is an address. Last place Marcus was seen. If you really want answers, that's where you'll find them." Elijah stared at the paper, his stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and determination. "Do you think he's still alive?" he asked. Raymond shrugged. "Only one way to find out." Eleanor's face tightened. "Elijah, you don't have to do this. You've already been through so much." "I need to," Elijah interrupted, his voice firm. "I've spent my whole life not knowing. I can't keep living like that." Eleanor nodded, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "Then we'll do it together." Elijah didn't argue. For the first time, he felt like he didn't have to face the unknown alone. But as they left Raymond's house and drove into the night, a heavy feeling settled over both of them. Neither could shake the sense that whatever lay ahead at that address would change everything for better or worse. The address led them to a small desolate town on the outskirts of the city, a place that felt forgotten, with its crumbling buildings and empty streets. The air seemed heavier here, as though the weight of past stories lingered, pressing down on everything and everyone who remained. Elijah sat in the passenger seat of Eleanor's car, clutching Marcus's journal like it was a lifeline. He had read the pages over and over during